So I want you to try this little thought experiment with me to kick things off.
Okay, I'm ready.
Imagine you go to sleep on New Year's Eve, right? January 1st, 1890.
Right.
And you fall asleep in a country that is, fundamentally still this continental republic. The frontier is still this very powerful, active idea.
Yeah, definitely.
Things are mostly lit by gaslight or oil lamps. The rhythm of your life is largely dictated by the sun and local geography. And then you wake up.
Okay.
But it's not the next morning. It is December 1899.
Oh, wow. I mean, the sheer sensory and honestly, the psychological whiplash of that experience would just be staggering.
Right.
You'd be stepping into an environment that essentially broke all the pre-existing rules of time, space, and even national identity.
Exactly. Because you went to sleep in that relatively isolated republic and you wake up in an overseas empire. An empire that's actively fighting this brutal counterinsurgency war in the Philippines.
Right, the whole geopolitical map just flips.
And, you wake up in a world where moving photographs exist. They're projecting reality onto walls. Entire city grids are glowing electrically against the night sky, turning midnight into noon.
Which was completely unprecedented.
And on top of that, a catastrophic economic depression has completely remapped the political alignment of the country. And out in the steel towns and the rail yards, factory workers are fighting literal armed battles with privatized corporate security forces.
Yeah, it's akin to closing your eyes in one operating system and waking up in an entirely different, vastly more complex architecture.
It really is.
It's the absolute definition of a paradigm shift. And that chaotic, glittering, violent, and transformative 10-year span is, well, it's the focus of our analysis today.
It is. We are pulling apart a massive stack of historical research on the 1890s for this deep dive. And our mission here isn't just to, rattle off a list of dates or dead presidents.
No, not at all.
The goal is to uncover how this single specific decade drew the exact blueprint for modern power. We're looking at how this era manufactured consumer desire out of thin air and how it laid down the invisible systemic infrastructure of control that you and I are still living inside today.
Right. And jumping into the sources, they immediately force us to confront this really highly uncomfortable central paradox.
Yeah, the progress thing.
Exactly. When analyzing the 1890s, applying the word progress becomes a deeply fraught exercise. The material forces us to constantly ask one specific mitigating question, which is progress for whom?
Because if you just look at the raw metrics, the era looks like an unbroken upward trajectory.
Yeah, he really does.
The sources detail these factories pushing out goods at an unprecedented scale, railroads moving freight across vast continental distances with ruthless efficiency, and these monumental leaps in public health, like the widespread acceptance of germ theory.
And antiseptic surgery, right?
Yeah, antiseptic surgery. If you were a consumer with just a little bit of disposable income, the sheer abundance must have felt miraculous.
Oh, totally. You suddenly have access to cheaper, mass-produced clothing, canned foods that actually survive the winter, and the safety bicycle.
Right, which radically transformed personal mobility.
It did. So the illusion of unalloyed progress is incredibly potent here. The material standard of living, for many people, did objectively rise.
Yeah.
But the sources ask us to look beneath the surface of that abundance. Like, let's examine the factory floor, where those cheaper goods were actually being produced.
Because there's always a cost.
Always. Industrial efficiency during this period relied on a total reorganization of human labor. Mass production lowered prices for the consumer, sure, but for the worker. It meant the imposition of strict managerial discipline,
Right.
repetitive microtasks, the introduction of incredibly dangerous high-speed machinery, and the widespread use of child labor.
I was trying to map this onto a modern experience to really grasp the mechanics of it, and it feels a lot like downloading a highly anticipated software update for your life.
Oh, that's a great analogy.
Like the new interface is sleek, it runs 10 times faster, you get all these incredible new features. But buried deep in the terms of service, the part literally nobody reads is a clause stating you have just handed over total control of your personal data.
Your location tracking, your camera.
Exactly. You gain immense convenience, but you forfeit your autonomy in the process. The 1890s industrial machine seems to have operated on a similar unread contract.
That is an incredibly apt structural comparison, really.
Yeah.
Because the historical text makes a brilliant, kind of counterintuitive point here. Industrial efficiency in the 1890s didn't just accidentally reduce worker autonomy.
Sure.
It required the worker to be less autonomous.
Wait, really? It was a requirement.
Yeah, absolutely.
Right.
Prior to this, a skilled artisan controlled their own tools, their own pace, and the entire production process of, say, a shoe or a chair.
Right, they were the master of the whole process.
Exactly. The new industrial model intentionally de-skilled the labor. Management broke the creation of a shoe down into, like, 50 mindless steps. The machine dictated the pace of the human, which rendered the individual worker completely replaceable.
So the knowledge of how to build the thing was basically transferred from the worker's brain into the machinery and the management layer.
Yes.
So the worker becomes just another physical input, like coal or steel.
And that dynamic of transferring power upward, it replicates itself across the entire technological landscape of the decade. Consider the railroads.
Oh.
They were the dominant infrastructural network of the 19th century, connecting the continent, accelerating commerce. For a farmer in the American Midwest, the railroad was an undeniable liberation from the tyranny of geography.
Because they could suddenly sell their wheat in New York or, even London. But looking at the transportation data in our sources, I have to ask about the trade-offs here. If I'm that farmer and my market has expanded globally, I'm presumably making more money. The railroad gave me access. So why do the sources characterize this relationship as a trap rather than a mutual benefit?
Because it created a severe structural choke point. The farmer could reach a global market, yes, but they could only do so through the single railroad line that happened to run through their county.
Ah, right. No alternatives.
Zero. The farmer possessed zero bargaining power. Railroads in the 1890s operated as natural monopolies in many rural areas, and they engaged in really aggressive rate discrimination.
What does that mean, practically?
Well, they would charge exorbitant short-haul rates to local farmers, just to subsidize the highly competitive long-haul routes between major cities.
Oh, wow. So the farmers were basically footing the bill for the city competition.
Exactly. The farmer was liberated from local geography only to become entirely dependent upon an infrastructure owned and manipulated by distant corporate boards. If the railroad raised the freight rate by 2 cents a bushel, that farmer's entire profit margin evaporated.
That is wild. They traded geographical isolation for systemic vulnerability.
Perfectly said.
That makes total sense.
Yep.
And the sources point out this identical pattern in the rollout of electricity, don't they?
Yeah, electricity is perhaps the most visceral example of this shift. Prior to the 1890s, if you wanted light, you chopped wood or bought kerosene for your own lamp. You controlled your energy source.
Right.
The advent of electric streetcars and municipal illumination was just breathtaking. It literally pushed back the darkness.
But the infrastructure required to generate that magic is massive. You cannot build a centralized alternating current power plant in your basement.
Precisely the point our sources emphasize. Electricity necessitates a sprawling, capital-intensive infrastructure, generating plants, miles of copper wiring, municipal franchises just to tear up the streets, and a really sophisticated maintenance grid.
So the technology itself demands centralization.
Yes. Consequently, the adoption of electricity created a massive new political and economic arena where power could concentrate. The men who owned the generating plants and secured the city contracts, they held the literal switch to the city's economy.
Man. So the overarching theme here is that technological progress does not dissolve power dynamics.
No, not at all.
It simply upgrades them. A new machine or network frees you from a localized natural constraint only to hardwire you into a vast artificial dependency.
Yeah, that's it exactly. Let's expand on how that power was wielded against specific populations, because the human cost of this scale is really central to the era.
Yeah, the sources get into some heavy stuff here.
They do. They dedicate significant time to exposing the profound cowardice of these entrenched power structures when they were challenged by marginalized groups.
Well, let me present an economic counterargument here, just based on classic market theory.
Okay, go for it.
If the United States is industrializing rapidly, experiencing explosive GDP growth, and requiring massive amounts of labor and consumer participation, shouldn't there be a massive economic incentive to utilize all available human capital?
You would think so, purely on paper.
Right. Segregation and racial oppression seem incredibly inefficient from a purely capitalist perspective. So why do the sources argue that racial hierarchy actually hardened and became more institutionalized during this era of rapid modernization?
It's a really fundamental question. The assumption that capitalism inherently dissolves racial boundaries for the sake of efficiency ignores the social utility of those boundaries.
Okay, social utility.
Yeah. The sources look closely at the experience of Black Americans in the 1890s to explain this. In the decades following emancipation, there had been immense, undeniable progress. Black communities had established independent property ownership. They built extensive educational networks, formed autonomous political organizations, and elected representatives to public office, particularly in the South.
So they were actively participating in the civic and economic life of the Republic.
They were, and that tangible success is exactly what triggered the systemic backlash of the 1890s.
Wow.
The white power structure recognized that economic progress was translating into political power, and they moved aggressively to dismantle it. This wasn't about economic efficiency. It was about political and social supremacy.
Right. It was about control.
Exactly.
Yeah.
This decade sees the systematic implementation of disenfranchisement. States rewriting their constitutions to strip Black men of the vote using mechanisms like poll taxes and strategically deployed literacy tests.
The literacy tests are a fascinating and just horrifying mechanism because on paper, they look race neutral, allowing the states to bypass the 15th Amendment.
The legal architecture of Jim Crow was deliberately deceptive. A registrar would ask a white applicant to read a really simple sentence, while a Black applicant, perhaps a college graduate, would be asked to interpret a highly obscure, complex clause of the state constitution.
That is just blatant.
The system required elaborate, state-sanctioned cheating to maintain itself. This era also saw a horrific peak in racial terror and lynchings, which were utilized as extra-legal tools to enforce the new economic subordination. And centrally, in 1896, the Supreme Court handed down the Plessy v. Ferguson decision.
Ah, the ruling that legally codified separate but equal.
Yes, it provided the federal constitutional stamp of approval for apartheid. The nation was building futuristic electric grids, but legally and socially, it was engineering a rigid caste system.
The juxtaposition is crazy.
And the sources note the deep insecurity of this dominance. I mean, a supposedly natural superiority shouldn't require manipulated voter rolls, heavily armed mobs, and Supreme Court gymnastics to survive.
Exactly. The system had to be meticulously rigged. And the sources draw a parallel to the treatment of Indigenous peoples during the same window, focusing heavily on the weaponization of language.
The linguistic framing is so crucial here. When federal policymakers and corporate interests discuss Western expansion in the 1890s, they use terms like development, assimilation, and civilization.
It sounds very positive.
Right. It painted the process as a benevolent, inevitable march of progress.
But the mechanics of that development for Indigenous communities meant the Dawes Act.
Yes, exactly.
It meant taking communally held tribal lands, breaking them up into individual allotments to force a Western concept of private property onto the tribes, and then, conveniently selling off the massive amounts of surplus land to white settlers and railroad companies.
The destruction of political autonomy was packaged as philanthropy. It's chilling. The era also saw the aggressive expansion of the federal boarding school system, where Indigenous children were removed from their families to eradicate their language, religion, and culture.
Yeah, the sources are really unflinching about that.
The underlying lesson from the texts is that we must always interrogate the word development. Development merely describes an alteration in the environment. It does not contain a moral compass.
That's a great point.
One civilization's infrastructural progress was entirely predicated on another's dispossession.
So moving to another demographic shift highlighted in the texts, we see the rise of the new woman in the 1890s. The imagery of the era shows women riding bicycles, entering higher education, working as typists or switchboard operators in the new corporate skyscrapers.
Yeah, there was a genuine expansion of female presence in the public sphere. The invention of the typewriter, for instance, created an entirely new clerical class that brought millions of women into the urban workforce.
Wow, just from one invention.
Yeah. Furthermore, women were forming massive national organizations like the General Federation of Women's Clubs and the Women's Christian Temperance Union, exerting significant social pressure.
But the sources use a very specific phrase to describe this newfound mobility. They call it an insulting little leash. I want to delve into the distinction the text makes between having influence and possessing actual power. Women were allowed to engage in what they called municipal housekeeping, cleaning up city corruption, or advocating for child labor laws because it was seen as an extension of their natural maternal roles.
Yes, they were granted the platform to nurture, to persuade, and to organize charitable reform. They performed the grueling daily duties of governance and social welfare. Yet they were systematically denied the formal architecture of power,
The ballot box.
the ballot box. They were legally subordinate under the law, excluded from national voting rights, and economically restricted in property ownership in many states.
So they could lobby the politicians, but they couldn't vote them out.
Exactly. It is the stark difference between holding influence and wielding structural authority. You can advise the decision makers, but you are barred from making the decision yourself.
Which is incredibly frustrating.
And this dynamic is worth reflecting on even today. We frequently conflate having a voice, having a platform, or cultural visibility with possessing the institutional power to actually alter the rules of the system.
Right. Having a megaphone doesn't mean you have a seat at the drafting table.
Absolutely.
This brings us to a moment where all of these contradictions, the glittering technology, the massive wealth, the systemic inequality, were literally built into a physical space. The World's Columbian Exposition in Chicago in 1893.
Oh, man. The definitive cultural spectacle of the late 19th century.
The sources describe a manufactured wonderland. The architects constructed massive, temporary neoclassical palaces painted pristine white, earning it the nickname the White City.
Yeah.
It featured the world's first Ferris wheel, designed specifically to outdo the Eiffel Tower from the previous Paris Exposition. The fairgrounds were illuminated by hundreds of thousands of alternating current electric lights, which was a marvel for people who had never seen an electric bulb.
I can't even imagine seeing that for the first time.
It was an entire society building a fantasy version of itself, completely devoid of the soot, poverty, and labor strife that defined actual 1890s Chicago.
It was a curated projection of American imperial and industrial might. It functioned as an enormous educational campus designed to instruct the public on what modern civilization should look like and who belonged at the top of its hierarchy.
It reminds me so much of a modern, heavily curated social media feed.
Oh, that's a perfect comparison.
The lighting is engineered to be flawless, the angles deliberately crop out the messiness of reality, and the entire production is designed to induce awe, aspiration, and a distinct sense of inadequacy. It was national branding masquerading as a public exhibition.
The parallel to modern curation is really strong there, particularly regarding the cultivation of aspiration. The World's Fair, alongside the explosive growth of department stores in the 1890s, signaled the birth of modern consumer capitalism.
Right.
The sources devote considerable analysis to how retail spaces like Marshall Field's in Chicago or Macy's in New York completely transformed the psychology of acquisition.
Because before this, shopping was largely a utilitarian chore. You needed flour, you bought flour. You needed a warm coat, you bought wool.
Exactly. But the department store turned consumption into a theatrical experience.
How so?
They utilized massive plate glass display windows, strategic mirror placement, elegant electric lighting, and really sophisticated spatial design. They graphed a psychological truth that would define the 20th century.
Which is?
That consumer desire is not innate. It is highly malleable and can be manufactured.
You don't walk into the department store because you need a specific dress to protect you from the elements.
Right.
The architecture of the store, the advertising, the display, it all works together to make you suddenly want the lifestyle and the identity associated with that dress. You are purchasing a projection of yourself.
Perfectly stated. But this shift toward mass consumption created a profound new vulnerability for the public. Think about the economic relationships prior to the 1890s. If you bought meat, you likely knew the local butcher. If you bought a tool, you knew the blacksmith. The transaction was rooted in direct, local knowledge and personal accountability.
But with the rise of national markets, that accountability just vanishes. Suddenly, families are buying products from the Sears, Roebuck & Co. mail-order catalog. They're eating food processed in massive meatpacking plants hundreds of miles away, sealed in tin cans. They're wearing garments stitched in distant sweatshops.
Brand reputation and advertising had to replace direct, verifiable knowledge. And this introduces one of the most critical concepts the sources present.
Okay, what's that?
The information imbalance.
The information imbalance.
Yep. When a consumer buys a tin of beef or a bottle of patent medicine, they have absolutely no way of knowing what the manufacturer knows. They don't know the chemical preservatives used, the sanitary conditions of the plant, or the labor practices involved.
And the text poses a really chilling question based on this dynamic. If the buyer is structurally prevented from knowing what the seller knows, is the transaction actually taking place between equals?
Right. And the answer the era provided was a resounding no. The convenience of mass-produced goods was purchased at the direct cost of severe information asymmetry.
Right.
The corporation held all the data. The consumer held all the risk. And that asymmetry is a potent form of societal control.
Wow, and the illusion of the 1890s was that this massive engine of production could run infinitely without overheating. But you cannot have the staggering wealth of the department store owners coexisting with the desperate, unregulated poverty of the industrial working class without the ecosystem eventually tearing itself apart.
It's just unsustainable.
The sources note that even the most dominant apex predator requires a stable, functioning environment to survive.
And the facade shattered entirely in 1893. The nation plunged into a catastrophic financial panic.
The Panic of 1893. What were the specific mechanical triggers for this collapse? Because the sources indicate it wasn't just a minor recession, it was a systemic failure.
It really was. The roots lay in massive overspeculation, particularly in railroad construction. And this was fueled by unstable banking practices and the depletion of the U.S. Treasury's gold reserves.
Okay.
When the Philadelphia and Reading Railroad went bankrupt in early 1893, it triggered a chain reaction. Banks called in loans, businesses couldn't secure credit, and the stock market crashed.
The ripple effects were devastating. Unemployment soared to somewhere around 20% in industrial centers. Families faced mass evictions. And thousands of transient workers, sometimes called Coxey's Army, began marching on Washington demanding federal relief.
Yeah, that was unprecedented.
It forced a fundamental reevaluation of the social contract. If the government and the legal system protected the rights of the corporations to build this massive interconnected economy, did the government also hold responsibility for the citizens who were crushed when the machine broke down?
And the conservative political consensus of the time maintained that the government had absolutely no role in economic relief. They viewed poverty as an individual moral failing rather than a systemic flaw.
Which is wild, given the systemic crash.
I know. But the working class did not accept this passively. The severe economic contraction of the 1890s produced some of the most violent labor conflicts in American history. The sources focused tightly on two defining battles.
Right, the Homestead Strike of 1892 and the Pullman Strike of 1894.
Exactly.
I want to analyze the strategy of the labor movement here. We've established that the corporations controlled the capital, the political infrastructure, and the courts. Facing those odds, how did workers exert any leverage at all? What was the mechanism of their resistance?
Well, the workers recognized the same principle of scale that the monopolies used.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, think about it. A single steel worker approaching a floor manager to demand a wage increase has zero leverage. They are instantly fired and replaced. But if 3,000 skilled steel workers act in perfect unison, they remove the one variable the corporation cannot instantly replicate.
Specialized human labor.
Exactly. The strike was an attempt to match corporate concentration with labor concentration.
So the union essentially attempts to become a counter-monopoly.
That is exactly the dynamic at play. At Andrew Carnegie's Homestead Steel Plant in Pennsylvania, plant manager Henry Clay Frick deliberately provoked a strike to break the powerful Amalgamated Association of Iron and Steel Workers.
He wanted the fight.
He did. He locked the workers out, built a literal barbed wire fence around the facility, and hired a private army of Pinkerton detectives to secure the plant so he could bring in replacement workers.
This resulted in a literal gun battle on the banks of the Monongahela River between the striking workers and the Pinkertons, which the workers actually initially won.
They won the battle, yeah, but they lost the war
Mm,
because the corporation simply escalated the conflict to the state level.
right.
The governor of Pennsylvania deployed the state militia to retake the town and protect the corporation's property rights, which allowed Frick to completely break the union.
Wow. And the Pullman strike in 1894 followed a similar, even more expansive trajectory.
It did. George Pullman operated a massive manufacturing complex for luxury sleeping cars, and this was surrounded by a quintessential company town.
Meaning he owned everything.
Everything. He owned the workers' homes, the stores, even the church. During the Depression of 1893, Pullman drastically cut his workers' wages to protect his dividend payouts to investors.
But he didn't lower the cost of living.
Nope. He refused to lower the rents in the company-owned housing. The workers were essentially trapped in a feudal arrangement, facing literal starvation. So they went on strike. And here is where the mechanism of scale becomes truly national.
Okay.
They appealed to the American Railway Union, led by Eugene V. Debs.
And the ARU initiates a sympathy strike. They tell their members nationwide to refuse to handle any train that includes a Pullman car.
It was a brilliant, highly effective choke point strategy. Within days, the ARU paralyzed rail traffic across the entire western half of the United States.
That's incredible.
They proved that an organized labor network could halt national commerce just as effectively as a corporate monopoly.
And the federal government's response was brutal and immediate.
Oh, yeah. The railroad companies purposefully attached U.S. mail cars to the Pullman trains. When the workers refused to move the trains, the federal government, under President Grover Cleveland, declared they were interfering with the delivery of the mail.
Ah, a legal loophole.
Exactly. The government secured a federal court injunction against the union, and ironically, they utilized the Sherman Antitrust Act to do it.
Wait, the act that was designed to break up corporate monopolies?
Yes, they used it against the labor union instead, claiming the union was a monopoly and restraint of trade. Federal troops were sent into Chicago, leading to widespread riots, deaths, and the utter destruction of the union.
So the government stepped in to ensure that the massive scale of the corporation was protected, while the massive scale of the labor union was criminalized.
Yes.
This raw display of state power backing corporate interests feeds directly into the massive political insurgency of the decade, doesn't it? The rise of the populist movement and the election of 1896.
It really fuels it. The People's Party, or the Populists, represented a profound ideological challenge to the dominant economic order. The movement originated in the agrarian South and West, among farmers who were being decimated by falling crop prices,
Right.
predatory crop lien credit systems, and the exorbitant freight rates of the railroad monopolies we discussed earlier.
They looked at the landscape of the 1890s and completely rejected the narrative that this was just a natural, inevitable evolution of the free market. They saw a system where the rules were explicitly written by the wealthy, for the wealthy,
Exactly.
and they came armed with specific radical policy demands.
They did. The Omaha Platform of 1892 outlines their specific remedies. They demanded the nationalization of the railroads and telegraph lines, arguing that natural monopolies essential to public life should be owned by the public.
That's huge.
They demanded a graduated income tax to redistribute concentrated wealth. And most famously, they demanded the free and unlimited coinage of silver.
Okay, let's break down the silver versus gold debate. Because it sounds archaic to modern ears, but it was essentially a battle over inflation and debt.
Yeah, the United States was on the gold standard, meaning the money supply was strictly limited by the amount of gold reserves. This caused deflation.
Right.
For a banker lending money, deflation is excellent. The dollars you are paid back are worth more than the ones you lent. But for a farmer drowning in a 10-year mortgage, deflation is lethal. They are earning less for their wheat every year, but their debt remains fixed.
So the populists wanted to coin silver to massively expand the money supply, cause inflation, raise crop prices, and make it easier to pay off their debts.
Exactly. It was a direct wealth transfer strategy from the creditor class of the Northeast to the debtor class of the South and West.
And this culminated in the 1896 presidential election, which the sources frame as a battle for the very soul of the country.
Oh, it was the climax of the decade.
Yeah.
You had the Democratic nominee, William Jennings Bryan, who absorbed the populist energy and campaigned fiercely against the gold standard with his famous Cross of Gold speech.
Right, representing the rural agrarian vision of America.
Exactly. Opposing him was Republican William McKinley, backed by the brilliant political operative Mark Hanna. They represented the gold standard, high tariffs, and the rising urban industrial corporate order.
And Hanna essentially invents modern campaign finance during this election, right?
It really does.
He goes to the major monopolies, Standard Oil, the major banks, the railroads, and assesses them a percentage of their assets to fund McKinley's campaign, basically terrifying them with the prospect of Bryan's radical economics.
Yeah.
And McKinley wins the election handily.
He does. The Urban Industrial Alliance triumphed. The corporations secured their grip on the political apparatus. However, the historical texts emphasize a crucial nuance here.
What's that?
The Populist Party collapsed, but their intellectual framework survived. The demands they mainstreamed in the 1890s, the income tax, the direct election of senators, banking reform, and business regulation, those became the exact blueprint for the progressive era reforms of the early 20th century. The ideas were merely resting, waiting for a more palatable political vehicle.
So the 1890s set the parameters for arguments we are still having.
100%.
Before we synthesize all of this into the ultimate philosophical dilemma of the era, the sources dedicate significant effort to dismantling the historical fog surrounding this decade. There is a tendency to view the late 19th century through a sepia-toned, simplistic lens.
Yeah, a lot of myths.
Let's run through a rigorous myth-busting analysis based on the text.
Let's do it. We must clear away the inaccurate nostalgia to see the mechanics of the era clearly.
Okay, myth number one. Everyone died in their early 40s. The assumption is that adult life was incredibly brief before modern medicine.
Right, and that's a statistical misinterpretation. It is true that average life expectancy at birth hovered in the low 40s. However, that mathematical average was severely dragged down by tragic astronomical rates of infant and childhood mortality.
Okay, so it's a math issue.
Yeah. If a person survived the gauntlet of childhood diseases, living into their 60s, 70s, or even 80s was entirely commonplace. The society wasn't devoid of the elderly. Rather, death from infection, workplace accidents, or childbirth intruded upon daily adult life with much greater frequency and suddenness than we experience today.
Got it. Myth number two. Without television or the internet, it was a fundamentally uninformed, isolated society.
Completely contrary to the evidence, the 1890s possessed a dense, highly sophisticated information ecosystem.
Really?
Oh yeah, urban centers boasted multiple daily newspapers fiercely competing for readership. Telegraph networks flashed global news to rural depots within hours. Political campaigns generated mountains of dense, multi-page pamphlets that citizens read voraciously.
Having fewer notifications might actually have made them more focused, not less informed.
Exactly. Information traveled physically slower, but the populace was deeply engaged. The partisan press ecosystem was robust, and civic participation measured by voter turnout was significantly higher than it is today.
Myth number three. The Victorians were old-fashioned and technologically timid. We look at the stiff collars, the corsets, the horse-drawn carriages, and assume a slow-paced society.
Well, the aesthetic was traditional, sure, but the underlying systemic engineering was aggressively, almost terrifyingly modern.
How so?
This is the decade that engineered steel-framed skyscrapers, built intricate urban mass transit subways and elevated trains, launched multi-million-dollar national advertising campaigns, and birthed professional corporatized sports leagues. The visual texture of the era looks antique, but the economic and infrastructural systems they deployed are the exact ones running our world right now.
This leads to myth number four, which is deeply entrenched in modern political debates. The myth that the Gilded Age and the 1890s represented an era of pure, unregulated, laissez-faire capitalism. I want to examine this closely because if there was no income tax, no environmental protection agency, and no federal welfare state, wasn't this the definition of the government staying completely out of the free market?
The sources dismantle this ideological fantasy completely.
Really?
Oh, absolutely. The assertion that the 1890s featured a hands-off government is historically false. The state was intimately, powerfully involved in structuring the economy. It simply intervened on behalf of capital rather than labor.
Well, consider the tariff policies.
Precisely. The federal government enacted massive protective tariffs to shield American manufacturers from European competition. That is, direct state intervention to guarantee corporate profits.
Right.
The government utilized the court system to issue sweeping injunctions against labor unions and, as we discussed with the Pullman strike, deployed federal military force to act as a taxpayer-funded strike-breaking service for the railroads. The state gave away hundreds of millions of acres of public land to railroad corporations to subsidize their expansion.
So the political argument of the 1890s was never actually a debate between government intervention and no government intervention.
Correct. The actual debate was, whose interests will the massive power of the federal government protect? The industrial titans loudly championed laissez-faire only when reformers attempted to regulate workplace safety or limit monopolies.
Hypocritical.
Highly. They were entirely supportive of massive government intervention when it arrived in the form of a land grant, a protective tariff, or a federal bayonet aimed at a striking worker.
That distinction is paramount, and it transitions perfectly into the final myth. Myth 5. Monopolies, like John D. Rockefeller's Standard Oil, were simply cartoon villains whose only goal was to gouge the consumer with astronomically high prices.
This is where the history demands nuance. If monopolies were merely inefficient price gougers, they would have been easy to defeat, both economically and politically.
Right, someone would just undercut them.
Exactly. The terrifying brilliance of a monopoly like Standard Oil was that it created breathtaking economies of scale. Through ruthless vertical and horizontal integration, owning the oil wells, the refineries, the barrel manufacturers, and the pipeline networks, Rockefeller actually drove the consumer price of kerosene down significantly.
Okay, so he stabilized a chaotic boom and bust industry and delivered a cheaper, standardized product to the consumer. So where is the structural threat?
The threat lay in how they maintained that dominance. They did not just outcompete their rivals in a fair market. They utilized their massive leverage to alter the rules of the market itself.
Okay, how?
Standard Oil secretly colluded with the railroads to secure massive rebates on their shipping costs. Even more sinister, they forced the railroads to pay them drawbacks, meaning Standard Oil received a cut of the shipping fees paid by their own competitors.
Wait. They rigged the infrastructure so that every time a competitor shipped a barrel of oil, Rockefeller made a profit.
Yes, their ambition was structural. They didn't just want to win the game of capitalism.
Yeah.
They wanted to restructure the entire economic environment so that competition itself became a physical impossibility.
Wow.
They transitioned from being a participant in the market to being the sovereign ruler of the market. And allowing a private, unaccountable corporation to wield that level of sovereign power is incredibly dangerous to a democratic republic, regardless of whether the price of the commodity goes down.
This analysis brings us to the absolute philosophical core of our deep dive. The ultimate dilemma forged in the 1890s, which remains entirely unresolved today. The friction between free market consolidation and the necessity of state regulation.
Let's frame the theoretical paradox the sources present.
Okay.
The promise of the free market is that if a company is genuinely superior, if they innovate better technology, organize their logistics more efficiently, and offer a cheaper product, they will dominate the sector. They shouldn't be penalized for excellence.
Right. If you build a vastly superior mousetrap, you are entitled to the spoils of the market.
But the 1890s revealed the flaw in that logic. What happens when winning the mousetrap market provides a corporation with so much capital and leverage that they can buy up all the raw materials, control the only roads leading out of town, and bankrupt any future inventor who dares to sketch a new mousetrap design?
They become the only game in town.
At that juncture, the free market has cannibalized itself. The winner has become a monopoly that stifles the very innovation that allowed it to rise in the first place.
And the public recognizes this threat, and society demands a referee. We demand the government step in and regulate the monopoly to restore competition. Thus, we get the Interstate Commerce Commission to regulate the railroads and the Sherman Antitrust Act.
Right. But the historical text highlights the vicious, inescapable trap hidden inside the concept of regulation. To combat the immense, concentrated power of a private monopoly, you must construct an equally massive, concentrated apparatus of public power.
Ah, I see.
You must empower an administrative state, unelected regulators and bureaucrats to decide which companies are too large, what profit margins are acceptable, and how markets should be structured.
So we diagnose the disease as concentrated private power, and our only known cure is concentrated public power.
Exactly.
But how does society prevent the government referee from becoming corrupted by the very players it is supposed to be officiating? The sources note how quickly the railroad monopolies engaged in regulatory capture, figuring out how to use the Interstate Commerce Commission to their own advantage to fix rates and lock out new competitors.
Now, that is the defining, intractable question of modern governance born in this decade. The 1890s proved that the dynamic is rarely a simplistic battle between good government and evil business. It is a clash of apex predators.
Apex predators.
Both the massive multinational corporation and the massive federal administrative state possess the power to crush the individual citizen. And crucially, both entities claim they're acting solely to protect that individual citizen.
Man. So the grand historical thesis presented by our sources is that the 1890s fundamentally and permanently eradicated the old 19th century American promise. The founding promise of the frontier republic was essentially negative liberty. Leave me alone, let me work my land, and I will be free.
Yes, and the events of the decade demonstrated that in a modernized, industrialized, and structurally interconnected society, the concept of being left alone is a physical and economic impossibility. The networks are too tight.
Right.
A speculative banking failure in New York triggers a wave of bankruptcies that ruins a factory town in Ohio. A railroad executive in a Chicago boardroom sets a freight rate algorithm that determines whether a family in Kansas eats or starves. A labor strike in the coal fields of Pennsylvania threatens to freeze citizens in Boston.
Every action creates a systemic ripple. You cannot unplug from the network without starving, but plugging into the network subjects you to the dictates of whoever controls the grid.
Because society became inextricably interconnected, the actions of private capital now carried massive public consequences. Private freedom generated public power.
Yeah.
And the realization of the 1890s is that a democratic society will be locked in a perpetual, unending argument over who gets to regulate that power.
Which perfectly distills the legacy of this incredible decade.
Hmm,
The 1890s did not complete America's modernization. It merely built the arena and established the parameters for the fights we'll be having for the rest of eternity.
truly.
Who is allowed to control the massive systemic networks? Who reaps the actual economic benefits of technological efficiency? And when the systems inevitably fracture and fail, who possesses the structural authority to rewrite the rules?
The architects of the 1890s built the modern machine. We are simply the generations tasked with living inside its gears.
That is beautifully said. And building on that reality, I want to leave you with a final thought to mull over. Drawing a direct line from the sources regarding consumer vulnerability and the information imbalance to our lives today.
Yeah.
In the 1890s, the consumer was rendered powerless because they had no capacity to inspect the industrial processes that sustained them. They couldn't know what toxic chemical preservatives were hidden inside their mass-produced canned food, nor could they see the grueling, dangerous labor conditions endured by the workers who stitched their ready-made clothing. They traded transparency for affordability and convenience, relying entirely on the curated brand reputation of massive trusts.
And if you look at the architecture of our world today,
Right. We are completely enveloped by algorithmic monopolies and invisible artificial intelligence machinery that we cannot personally inspect, audit, or even fully comprehend. We rely entirely on the brand reputation and the opaque terms of service of massive global tech conglomerates to curate our news, guide our financial decisions, and manage the vast oceans of our personal data.
it is a profoundly unsettling historical parallel. The technological platforms evolve rapidly, but the underlying mechanics of power remain startlingly consistent.
Exactly. If the 1890s taught us that extreme convenience inevitably creates a massive information imbalance, what invisible levers of systemic control have we happily handed over today just to get our metaphorical cheaper clothes and glittering electric streetcars?
Such a powerful question.
So the next time you tap agree on a 60-page terms of service update without reading a single word, or you marvel at the frictionless convenience of a new piece of automated technology, remember what it felt like to wake up in 1899. Progress is everywhere, shining brightly. But it is always, always worth asking. Progress for whom? Look closely at the systems of power hidden inside the architecture of your own ordinary life. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into the source material.